She thought I was dependent on her. Then the bank called. And long before that call ever happened, she had already built a very clear image of who I was and what my place was in her life. An image reinforced not by one big moment, but by hundreds of small, ordinary interactions that slowly stacked on top of each other until they felt permanent. Because from her point of view, everything important seemed to move through her hands. The bills arrived to her email, the payments went out from her accounts, the planning happened on her schedule, and every time money came up she spoke calmly and confidently, not to dominate the conversation but to conclude it. And that calm was persuasive in a way that made disagreement feel unnecessary, almost childish, as if questioning her conclusions would only prove that I didn't fully grasp how things worked. And I noticed early on that whenever I tried to explain myself or add context, the conversation subtly shifted into her reassuring me, reminding me how things were structured, why her way made sense, and why resistance would only complicate life for both of us. So over time I stopped pushing back, not because I believed she was always right, but because pushing back required more energy than it was worth and never actually changed the outcome. And that choice slowly reshaped how she interpreted my behavior, because silence, when repeated often enough, stops being seen as a choice and starts being seen as a trait. And in her mind, my quiet became proof that I relied on her, that I needed her to manage the important parts of life. And the more she believed that, the more natural it felt for her to speak on my behalf, to answer questions before I could respond, to frame decisions as things she had already handled. And none of this felt hostile or dramatic in the moment. It felt practical, efficient, even responsible, which is why it never triggered an argument. And I let that efficiency settle in because I could see how comfortable it made her, how relaxed she became when she didn't feel the need to double-check details or ask follow-up questions. And comfort like that is revealing, because when people feel secure, they stop watching the structure that gives them that security. They stop imagining scenarios where roles might shift, and they stop questioning assumptions that seem to have worked so far. And while her attention drifted away from the mechanics of how things actually functioned, mine moved closer, not out of resentment or ambition, but out of awareness, noticing how much of what we call control depends on habits rather than constant oversight, how permissions are granted once and rarely revisited, how access is often assumed instead of actively confirmed, and how easily certainty replaces curiosity when someone believes they fully understand the people around them. And during that time, she continued reinforcing the same narrative without realizing it, joking with friends about how she carried the responsibility, casually mentioning how lost I would be without her guidance, and smiling when those comments were met with nods and sympathetic looks. And I stayed quiet in those moments too, partly because correcting her would have felt awkward, and partly because I understood that the clearer her version of me became in her own mind, the less she would notice what I was actually paying attention to. And that was the part she never questioned, because people who believe they are indispensable rarely imagine that someone else is learning quietly, patiently, and without announcing it, especially when that someone has been labeled as dependent for so long that the label itself becomes a blindfold. After a while, that version of reality settled so deeply into her thinking that it began to guide her behavior without her ever consciously choosing it. Because when someone feels certain about their role, they stop actively maintaining it and start assuming it will hold on its own. And I could see that assumption show up in small but telling ways, like how she stopped asking me about details she used to check, how she began summarizing decisions as if they were already finalized, and how she treated money conversations as updates rather than discussions, all of which reinforced her belief that she was managing stability rather than sharing it. And the more that belief solidified, the less attention she paid to the structure beneath it, because confidence simplifies life and makes complexity feel unnecessary. And while her focus narrowed, my awareness expanded, not because I was planning a confrontation, but because I had the mental space to observe, noticing how systems rely on routine more than authority, how access often continues simply because no one questions it, and how many safeguards exist only on paper rather than in practice. And I never announced those observations because announcing them would have created friction, and friction would have forced her to re-engage. And engagement was the one thing I understood she no longer had the habit of doing, so I stayed consistent, predictable, and agreeable, which made her even more comfortable delegating oversight entirely to habit. And that comfort extended beyond our private life into the way she spoke about us to other people, describing herself as the responsible one and me as the one who benefited from her organization. And each time she repeated that story, it reinforced her confidence, while simultaneously narrowing her perception of me. Because once people believe they fully understand you, they stop updating that understanding. And that is when assumptions begin to harden into something that feels permanent, and permanence creates blindness, because it removes urgency, and urgency is what keeps people attentive to risk. And during that period, I noticed something subtle in myself as well, which was that I no longer felt the need to correct her or prove anything. Because proving competence to someone who has already decided who you are rarely changes their decision. It only feeds the dynamic they're comfortable with. And instead, I focused on consistency, on understanding the mechanisms that supported her sense of control, and on letting time do what confrontation never could, which was expose the gap between what she believed was secure and what was simply assumed to be. And by the time she started saying things like, "You don't need to worry about that, I've already handled it," she genuinely believed she was protecting both of us from unnecessary stress, never considering that protection without verification is just another form of risk, and never noticing that her confidence had quietly shifted from strength to vulnerability. Because she trusted the stability, she felt more than the structure that created it. And that trust, once it set in, made it almost impossible for her to imagine a scenario where control could move without her permission. The day everything finally surfaced didn't announce itself with tension or warning, which is why it took a moment for the weight of it to register, because she answered the phone the same way she always did, casually and without thinking, expecting confirmation rather than complication. And at first her tone didn't change at all, but as the call continued, I noticed small disruptions in her rhythm, the pause before she responded, the way she repeated a question she normally would have answered herself, and the slight tightening in her posture, as if she suddenly needed to ground herself in a situation that no longer felt familiar. And even without hearing the voice on the other end, I could tell that something was happening outside the framework she was used to controlling. Because confusion has a very specific energy when it appears where certainty used to live. And as the minutes passed, that confusion shifted into controlled disbelief, followed by a careful attempt to reassert authority through clarification and repetition. And when she covered the phone and looked at me, not with anger, but with an expression that mixed surprise and uncertainty, I realized this was the first time she was seeing me not as a fixed role, but as an unknown variable. And that realization unsettled her more than the call itself, because it challenged an assumption she had never questioned. And when the call finally ended, she didn't confront me or demand answers. She went quiet instead, and that quiet carried a different kind of tension, not emotional, but strategic. Like someone recalculating a route they had traveled so many times they never expected it to be blocked. And over the next several minutes, she asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. Questions framed as curiosity, yet designed to restore orientation, and I answered them calmly and without urgency, because urgency invites negotiation, and negotiation would have allowed her to regain footing. And the absence of urgency made it clear that whatever had shifted was not temporary. And the longer that calm stretched, the more her confidence thinned, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that showed up as repeated questions, half-finished sentences, and attempts to frame the situation as procedural rather than structural. And I let her do that, because people need time to reconcile the difference between what they believed was stable and what reality is suddenly revealing. And it was in those moments, watching her struggle to place this new information inside her old narrative, that I understood how deeply she had relied on certainty rather than awareness, and how that reliance had left her unprepared for a shift that didn't announce itself loudly, didn't require confrontation, and didn't offer a clear moment to push back against, because it wasn't an attack or a mistake or even a betrayal. It was simply the exposure of a system she hadn't checked in a very long time. And that exposure forced her to sit with something unfamiliar, the realization that control can move quietly, without permission, and without asking the person who once held it to acknowledge the change. After that day, nothing returned to the version of normal she was used to, even though on the surface very little seemed to change, because she continued with the same routines and the same tone, but the confidence behind them was no longer automatic. And I could sense that in the way she double-checked things she never used to question, in the way she hesitated before making statements that once came easily, and in the way her questions became more careful, more indirect, as if she were trying to understand the new boundaries without openly acknowledging that they existed. And during that time, she made several attempts to restore the balance she remembered, referencing past decisions, shared history, and the stability we once had. But those references felt more like reminders to herself than arguments meant to convince me, because the shift she felt wasn't something that could be undone through conversation. And I didn't respond with triumph or explanation, not out of coldness, but because explanations would have softened what needed to remain clear, and clarity, once established, doesn't require justification. And as days passed, I noticed something change in me as well, not a sense of victory or relief, but a steadiness that came from no longer needing to prove competence or seek permission, because the dynamic that once defined us had already dissolved, and the absence of that dynamic made space for a quieter form of control, one that doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. And when she eventually admitted that she felt blindsided, that she didn't understand how things could have shifted without her knowing, I almost told her that nothing had shifted suddenly, that everything had been moving slowly for a long time under the surface, but I chose not to, because the most lasting realizations are the ones people arrive at on their own. And by the way she paused after saying those words, by the way she avoided meeting my eyes, I knew she was already beginning to understand that her certainty had created the conditions for her own loss of control, and that understanding, unspoken and unresolved, became the true ending of the story, because power doesn't always end with a confrontation or a declaration. Sometimes it ends quietly, with one person adjusting to a reality they no longer direct, and another finally stepping out of a role they were never meant to stay in.